The morning mist hung low over Arlington National Cemetery as Sergeant Thompson adjusted his white gloves one final time. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the city beyond. In just a few minutes, hundreds of visitors would gather to witness something truly special. The changing of the guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Thompson had been doing this for 3 years now, but the responsibility never got easier. Every single day he knew he was standing for something bigger than himself. He was honoring soldiers who had given everything for their country, soldiers whose names were lost to history but whose sacrifice would never be forgotten. The tomb itself stood like a giant white marble block, simple but powerful. No fancy decorations, no gold trim, just clean lines and the words that meant everything. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God. Thompson had read those words thousands of times, and they still gave him chills. His uniform was perfect. Every button polished until it gleamed, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. The rifle in his hands had been cleaned and inspected so many times that morning that it practically sparkled in the early sunlight. But there was one thing on his uniform that meant more to him than all the rest: a small bronze medal pinned to his chest. The Medal of Valor wasn't the biggest or flashiest decoration in the military, but Thompson wore it with quiet pride. He had earned it 2 years ago in Afghanistan during what the Army called an incident. Thompson just called it the worst day of his life. It had been a routine patrol in Kandahar province. 8 soldiers riding in 2 vehicles through a dusty village they had passed through dozens of times before. Thompson was driving the lead vehicle when everything went wrong in an instant. The explosion was so loud it felt like the world was ending. The truck flipped completely over, throwing soldiers everywhere like rag dolls. When Thompson came to, his ears were ringing and blood was running down his face. But he could hear something even worse than the explosion: screaming. His fellow soldiers were trapped under the burning vehicle, and enemy fighters were already moving in from the hills. Most people would have taken cover. Most people would have called for backup and waited for help. Thompson didn't think about any of that. He just ran toward the flames, grabbed the first soldier he could reach, and started pulling. Again and again he went back into that burning wreck, ignoring the bullets flying past his head, ignoring his own injuries, ignoring everything except getting his brothers out alive. By the time backup arrived, Thompson had saved 7 lives. The 8th soldier, Private Rodriguez, didn't make it. Thompson still thought about Rodriguez every single day. The medal was nice, but knowing that 7 families got to see their sons come home, that was what really mattered. Now, standing at the tomb, Thompson carried that weight with him. Every step he took, every movement he made was for all the soldiers who couldn't stand there themselves, for Rodriguez, for the unknown soldiers beneath his feet, for every man and woman who had ever worn the uniform and paid the ultimate price. The tourists were starting to gather now. Families with young children, elderly veterans wearing old military caps, foreign visitors speaking in hushed voices about American history. Thompson could see them from the corner of his eye, but he never looked directly at them. That wasn't his job. His job was to be a living statue, a symbol of unwavering dedication. 21 steps north. Turn. Face east for 21 seconds. Turn. 21 steps south. Turn. Face west for 21 seconds. Turn. Face south. Over and over, hour after hour, day after day. Each step measured precisely. Each turn executed with mechanical perfection. People sometimes asked him if it got boring. Thompson never knew how to answer that question. How do you explain that every single step means something? How do you tell someone that standing perfectly, still in all kinds of weather, blazing summer heat, freezing winter cold, driving rain, is actually one of the most important things you can do with your life? The other guards understood. They were a small, tight group of soldiers who had all volunteered for this duty. Not everyone could do it. The physical requirements were tough enough. You had to be a certain height, meet strict fitness standards, pass detailed background checks. But the mental part was even harder. Standing out there for hours at a time, knowing that thousands of people were watching your every move, knowing that you represented something sacred. It took a special kind of person. Thompson remembered his first week on duty. He had been so nervous that his hands shook during the changing of the guard ceremony. The sergeant training him had pulled him aside afterward and said something that stuck with him. "Son, you're not performing for those tourists. You're standing guard for soldiers who can't stand guard for themselves. Never forget that." He never had. The morning routine was always the same. Wake up at 5. Physical training, breakfast, uniform inspection that lasted for hours. Every single piece of equipment checked and double-checked. Shoes polished until they looked like black mirrors. Belt buckle aligned perfectly. Hat positioned at exactly the right angle. Then came the inspection of the tomb area itself. Every morning, the guards walked the entire perimeter, making sure everything was perfect. They checked for any debris that might have blown in overnight, any damage to the marble, any sign that anything was out of place. The tomb had to be absolutely pristine before the first visitors arrived. Thompson loved the early morning hours before the cemetery opened to the public. The quiet was so complete that he could hear birds singing in the distant trees. Sometimes a deer would wander through the area, and Thompson would watch it graze peacefully among the headstones. Those moments reminded him that even in a place dedicated to death, life continued. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text reminder about a court appearance later that week. Some ridiculous traffic ticket he had gotten a month ago. Thompson barely gave it a thought. It was just a minor speeding violation, something that would take 10 minutes to clear up. He had all the paperwork, all the documentation. Just a quick trip to the courthouse, pay the fine, and get back to what really mattered. As the first tour group of the day approached the tomb, Thompson took his position. His back straight, his eyes forward, his rifle held at the perfect angle. The Medal of Valor caught the morning sunlight, a small bronze reminder of what real courage looked like. He had no idea that in just a few days, that same medal would become the center of a controversy that would change his life forever. He had no idea that a simple court appearance would turn into a nightmare that would cost him everything he had worked for. He certainly had no idea that a judge's prejudice would soon make him famous for all the wrong reasons. For now, though, none of that mattered. All that mattered was the duty in front of him, the soldiers beneath his feet, and the promise he had made to honor their sacrifice with every breath in his body. Thompson straightened his dress uniform one last time before walking into the courthouse. He had decided to wear his military dress blues to court, not to show off, but simply because he had come straight from the ceremony at Arlington and didn't have time to change. The Medal of Valor sat proudly on his chest alongside his other ribbons, each one representing months or years of dedicated service. The courthouse was busy that Tuesday morning. People hurried past carrying manila folders and looking stressed. Thompson found the right courtroom and took a seat in the back, figuring this would be over in a few minutes. Traffic court was usually pretty straightforward. Show up, explain what happened, pay the fine, and leave. He looked around the courtroom while waiting for his case to be called. The judge's bench sat high above everything else, making whoever sat there look important and intimidating. The American flag hung in the corner, and Thompson felt a familiar surge of pride looking at it. That flag meant something to him. It represented every reason he had chosen to serve his country. Case number 4792, Thompson versus the state, called the court clerk. Thompson stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom. His military bearing was automatic, shoulders back, head high, eyes forward. Years of training had made these movements second nature. He approached the defendant's table and stood at attention, waiting for the judge to begin. Judge Brennan looked up from his paperwork and immediately frowned. His eyes went straight to Thompson's uniform, then to the medals on his chest. For a moment, the courtroom was completely silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Judge Brennan asked, his voice cold and sharp. Thompson was confused. "Sir, I'm here about my traffic citation." "Case number 4792. I can see that," the judge snapped. "What I'm asking about is this costume you're wearing." The word costume hit Thompson like a physical blow. He had been called many things in his 12 years of military service, but no one had ever called his uniform a costume. He kept his voice respectful but firm. "This is my military dress uniform, Your Honor. I came here directly from a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery." Judge Brennan's frown deepened. He leaned forward in his chair, staring directly at the Medal of Valor on Thompson's chest. "And I suppose you think you earned all those pretty decorations?" The question was so unexpected that Thompson almost didn't know how to respond. "Yes, sir. Each of these ribbons and medals represents specific achievements and service records that are documented in my military file." "Remove that medal immediately," Judge Brennan ordered. Pointing directly at the Medal of Valor. Thompson felt the world shift around him. Every person in the courtroom was now staring at him. The court reporter had stopped typing. Even the bailiff looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I don't understand." "Remove it now," the judge repeated, his voice getting louder. "I won't have someone standing in my courtroom wearing decorations they haven't earned." "This is a court of law, not some Halloween party." Thompson's mind raced. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but this was completely outside his experience. In the military, everything had clear rules and procedures. Here, he felt like he was in some kind of alternate reality where nothing made sense. "Your Honor, I can provide documentation for every decoration I'm wearing. My service record clearly shows—" "I don't want to hear your stories," Judge Brennan cut him off. "I've seen too many people like you come through here, pretending to be heroes when you've never even seen combat. Take off that medal or I'll hold you in contempt of court." The accusation stung worse than any physical injury Thompson had ever received. Never seen combat? He thought about Rodriguez, about pulling his fellow soldiers from that burning truck, about the nightmares that still woke him up some nights. He thought about every patrol, every mission, every moment of terror and brotherhood that had defined his service, but he also knew that arguing with a judge was not going to end well for him. Thompson reached up slowly and unpinned the Medal of Valor from his uniform. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from anger and disbelief. He held the medal in his palm, looking down at it. "All of them," Judge Brennan said. "Remove all of those fake decorations." Thompson looked up sharply. "Your Honor, with respect, these are not fake. I have official documentation for every single. Are you defying a direct order from this court?" The judge asked, his voice rising to almost a shout. The courtroom was dead silent now. Thompson could feel everyone watching him, waiting to see what he would do. Part of him wanted to stand his ground, to demand that the judge show him the same respect he would show any other citizen. But another part of him, the part trained to follow orders and maintain discipline, told him to just comply and get out of there. "No, Your Honor," Thompson said quietly. He began removing his ribbons one by one, placing them carefully on the table in front of him. Each one felt like he was giving away a piece of his identity. "That's better," Judge Brennan said with satisfaction. "Now, about this speeding ticket. You were going 15 miles over the limit on Route 95. How do you plead?" Thompson could barely focus on the question. His mind was still reeling from what had just happened. "Guilty, Your Honor." "Fine, that'll be $250. Plus court costs. Pay the clerk on your way out." That was it. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. Judge Brennan had already moved on to the next case, as if humiliating a decorated veteran was just another part of his morning routine. Thompson gathered his ribbons and medals from the table, his movements careful and deliberate. He put them in his pocket rather than pinning them back on his uniform. Walking out of that courtroom with a bare chest felt like the longest walk of his life. In the hallway outside, Thompson leaned against the wall and tried to process what had just happened. He had been preparing for this court appearance for weeks, gathering all his paperwork, making sure he understood the charges. Never in his wildest imagination had he thought he would be accused of stolen valor by a judge who didn't even know his name. Other people were walking past him, going about their normal business, completely unaware that Thompson's world had just been turned upside down. He looked down at the medals in his hand, thinking about all the men and women who had genuinely earned these honors. He thought about the soldiers who had died earning decorations. They would never get to wear ... as he walked toward the clerk's office to pay his fine. Thompson had no idea that someone in that courtroom had been recording the entire exchange on their phone. He had no idea that within hours, millions of people would see what had happened to him. He certainly had no idea that this humiliating moment would soon become the most important few minutes of his life. All he knew was that something fundamental had changed. For the first time in his military career, Thompson questioned whether the uniform he wore with such pride was really protecting him, or if it was just making him a target for people who had already decided what kind of person he was before he even opened his mouth. Rachel Martinez had been working as a court reporter for 8 years, and she thought she had seen everything. Angry defendants, crying families, lawyers who shouted too much, it was all part of the job. But what she witnessed that Tuesday morning in Judge Brennan's courtroom made her stomach turn. She had been typing away, recording the usual traffic violations and minor disputes when the soldier walked in. Rachel noticed his uniform immediately. Her brother had served 2 tours in Iraq, so she recognized the decorations on his chest. This wasn't some weekend warrior or fake veteran. This was clearly a real soldier with real medals. When Judge Brennan started attacking the man's uniform, Rachel's fingers froze over her keyboard. In all her years in that courtroom, she had never seen the judge act like this. Sure, Brennan could be tough, but this was something else entirely. This was personal. Rachel glanced around the courtroom. The bailiff looked uncomfortable but wasn't saying anything. The other people waiting for their cases were staring with their mouths open. Nobody seemed to know what to do. That's when Rachel made a decision that would change everything. She quietly pulled out her personal phone and started recording. The video quality wasn't perfect. She was trying to be discreet, holding the phone low and slightly hidden behind her computer screen. But the audio was crystal clear. Every word Judge Brennan said, every humiliating command he gave, was captured perfectly. Rachel watched through her phone screen as the soldier, with obvious pain in his eyes, slowly removed medal after medal from his uniform. The man's hands were shaking slightly, but he maintained his military composure throughout the entire ordeal. When he placed that bronze medal on the table, the one that looked like a Medal of Valor, Rachel's heart broke a little after the hearing ended and the soldier left. Rachel sat in her chair for several minutes, staring at the video on her phone. She had recorded similar incidents before, judges being rude, lawyers acting unprofessionally, but she had never done anything with those recordings. This felt different. During her lunch break, Rachel called her brother Danny. He was working construction now, but he still kept in touch with a lot of his military buddies. When she described what had happened, Danny was quiet for a long moment. "Rachel, you need to understand something," he finally said. "What you just described, that's every veteran's worst nightmare. Having some civilian question whether you earned your medals, especially in public like that. That's not just disrespectful, it's cruel." "So what should I do with this video?" Rachel asked. "Post it," Danny said without hesitation. "People need to see what happened to that soldier. They need to know what kind of person Judge Brennan really is." That evening, Rachel uploaded the video to her social media accounts. She wasn't a big social media user. She had maybe 200 followers, mostly family and friends. She wrote a simple caption: "Judge humiliates decorated veteran in court today. This is not okay." At first, nothing happened. A few likes from her cousins, a comment from her neighbor saying how awful it was. Rachel went to bed thinking maybe a dozen people would see it, and that would be the end of it. She was completely wrong. Rachel woke up the next morning to her phone buzzing nonstop. Hundreds of notifications were flooding her screen. The video had been shared overnight by someone with a much larger following and then shared again and again and again. It was spreading like wildfire across every social media platform. By the time Rachel got to work that morning, the video had been viewed over 50,000 times. By lunch, it was over 200,000. People were not just watching it, they were angry about it. Really angry. The comments were pouring in from all over the country. Veterans were sharing their own stories of being disrespected and questioned about their service. Active duty military members were expressing outrage that one of their brothers had been treated this way. Civilian supporters were demanding justice for the soldier and accountability for Judge Brennan. Local news stations started calling Rachel's phone. She had no idea how they got her number, but suddenly, everyone wanted to interview her about what she had witnessed. Rachel was torn. She was a court employee, and she worried about getting in trouble for recording in the courtroom. But she also knew that what she had captured was important. The first news segment aired that evening on the local NBC affiliate. They interviewed Rachel, played portions of the video, and tried to get a statement from Judge Brennan's office. The judge's staff refused to comment, but that just made people more angry. Within 24 hours, the story had gone national. CNN picked it up, then Fox News, then every major network. The video was being shared millions of times, and the hashtag Justice for Our Veteran was trending on multiple platforms. Veterans organizations started getting involved. The American Legion issued a statement condemning Judge Brennan's actions. The VFW called for an investigation. Disabled American Veterans posted the video on their official page with a message of support for the unnamed soldier, but it wasn't just veterans who were outraged. Parents were sharing the video, saying they couldn't imagine their children being treated this way after serving their country. Teachers were using it as an example of how not to treat people. Even celebrities started weighing in, with several famous actors and musicians sharing the video and demanding answers. Rachel found herself at the center of a media storm she never could have imagined. News trucks were parked outside her apartment. Reporters were calling her work. People were reaching out to thank her for standing up for the veteran, while others were criticizing her for recording in a courtroom without permission. The video itself became a phenomenon. People were analyzing every second of it, pointing out the soldier's dignified response to an impossible situation. They noticed how he never raised his voice, never disrespected the judge, never lost his military bearing even while being humiliated. That restraint and professionalism only made Judge Brennan's behavior look worse by comparison. Legal experts started appearing on news shows to discuss whether Judge Brennan had overstepped his authority. Some said judges had broad discretion in their courtrooms, but others argued that demanding a veteran remove legitimately earned decorations was clearly inappropriate and possibly illegal. The story took on a life of its own. People who had never heard of Judge Brennan before were now calling for his removal from the bench. Online petitions were started demanding an investigation into his conduct. Local politicians were being asked to take a position on what had happened. Meanwhile, Thompson had no idea that his worst day had become the most watched video in America. He had gone home after court, changed out of his uniform, and tried to forget about the whole humiliating experience. He wasn't on social media much, and he certainly wasn't expecting to become an overnight sensation. It wasn't until a fellow soldier called him the next evening that Thompson learned what was happening. "Dude, you need to get online right now." His friend said, "You're famous, and not in a bad way." Thompson sat at his computer, watching the video of his own humiliation being shared and discussed by millions of strangers. It was surreal and overwhelming. Part of him was grateful that people understood how wrong the judge's behavior had been. But another part of him was mortified that his worst moment was now public entertainment. He had no idea that this viral moment was just the beginning. Soon, investigators would be looking into Judge Brennan's background. Soon, his own military commanders would be making decisions about his future. Soon, Thompson would learn that sometimes winning in the court of public opinion comes with costs you never expected. Colonel Williams sat in his office at Arlington National Cemetery, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. The video had been playing on every news channel for 3 days straight, and now it was sitting in his email inbox with a red, urgent flag attached. His phone had been ringing nonstop with calls from reporters, Pentagon officials, and angry citizens demanding answers. The colonel had known Thompson for 3 years. He was one of the best guards they had ever had at the two, punctual, professional, and absolutely dedicated to the mission. Thompson had never caused any trouble, never complained about anything, and had earned the respect of every soldier in the unit. Now, through no fault of his own, he was at the center of a national controversy. Colonel Williams picked up his phone and called Thompson into his office. When Thompson arrived, he looked tired and stressed. The attention from the viral video had been overwhelming, and he clearly wasn't handling it well. "Sir, I want you to know that I never wanted any of this attention," Thompson said before the colonel could speak. "I just went to court to handle a traffic ticket. I had no idea anyone was recording." "I know that, Sergeant," Colonel Williams replied. "But we have a situation here that's bigger than what you intended. The Secretary of the Army's office has been calling. The media is camped outside our gates. And frankly, some people higher up the chain are not happy about all this publicity." Thompson felt his stomach drop. "Am I in trouble, sir?" Colonel Williams hesitated. That hesitation told Thompson everything he needed to know. Meanwhile, across town, investigators were already digging into Judge Brennan's background. The State Judicial Commission had opened a formal inquiry within 48 hours of the video going viral. What they found was disturbing. Judge Brennan had been on the bench for 12 years, and as investigators looked through his case files, a pattern began to emerge. African American defendants consistently received harsher sentences than white defendants for similar crimes. Veterans, particularly minority veterans, seemed to face unusual scrutiny in his courtroom. One case file from 2 years earlier showed Brennan questioning whether a Hispanic veteran's Purple Heart was legitimate, even though the man had provided all the required documentation. Another file showed him giving a black veteran the maximum sentence for a minor drug possession charge, while giving a white college student probation for the same offense. The investigation team interviewed dozens of lawyers who had appeared before Judge Brennan over the years. Many of them had stories to tell, but most had never reported the judge's behavior because they feared it would hurt their ability to represent future clients. "I always told my minority clients to be extra careful in Brennan's courtroom," one defense attorney admitted during his interview. "There was just something about the way he looked at them, the way he spoke to them. It was different." Court reporters who had worked with Brennan also came forward. They described a judge who made inappropriate comments about defendants' appearance, questioned their backgrounds in ways that had nothing to do with their cases, and seemed to have particular disdain for anyone in military uniform. The most damning evidence came from the court's own audio recordings. Investigators found dozens of cases where Brennan had made comments that showed clear bias. In one case, he had told a veteran seeking a reduced sentence for a parking violation, "Maybe you should have thought about consequences before you decided to play soldier." As the investigation gained momentum, Thompson found his own life becoming increasingly complicated. The Army had launched its own internal review to determine whether Thompson had violated any regulations by appearing in court in uniform. Even though he had done nothing wrong, the mere fact that he was under investigation made his commanders nervous. "The thing you have to understand," Colonel Williams explained during one of their many meetings, "is that the Tomb Guard is supposed to be invisible. We honor the unknown soldiers by maintaining dignity and avoiding controversy. This situation, even though it's not your fault, goes against everything we try to maintain here." Thompson felt like he was being punished for being a victim. He had followed all the rules, done everything right, and now he was being treated like he had somehow brought shame on the unit. It was the most frustrating experience of his military career. The media attention wasn't helping. Reporters were constantly trying to interview Thompson, but his commanding officers had ordered him not to speak to the press. Veterans groups wanted him to appear at rallies and protests supporting his cause, but again, he was forbidden from participating. He felt trapped between the public who saw him as a hero and the military that saw him as a problem. 3 weeks after the video went viral, Thompson was called into another meeting with Colonel Williams. This time, there were other officers present, people Thompson didn't recognize wearing suits instead of uniforms. "Sergeant Thompson," Colonel Williams began, "after careful consideration and consultation with higher headquarters, we've decided that it would be best for everyone involved if you were reassigned to another position." Thompson felt the floor drop out from under him. Sir, am I being punished for something I didn't do? This isn't punishment, one of the suited officials explained. This is about maintaining the integrity and dignity of the Tomb Guard mission. The level of media attention and public scrutiny surrounding your case makes it impossible for you to continue in this role effectively. But where am I being transferred? Thompson asked. Fort Riley, Kansas, administrative position. You'll be processing personnel files and handling routine paperwork. Thompson stared at them in shock. Fort Riley was in the middle of nowhere. Handling paperwork was about as far from honor guard duty as you could get. After 3 years of standing guard at one of the most sacred sites in America, he was being shipped off to push papers at a desk job. This is temporary, right? Thompson asked desperately. Once this whole thing blows over, I can come back? The officials exchanged glances. We'll reevaluate the situation as appropriate, was all they would say. That night, Thompson sat in his apartment looking at the Medal of Valor that had started this whole mess. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had earned this medal for saving lives, for putting himself in danger to help his fellow soldiers. Now, that same medal was being used as justification to end the career he loved. He thought about all the visitors who came to the tomb every day, all the families who brought their children to see the guards and learn about service and sacrifice. He thought about the unknown soldiers beneath the marble, and how he would never again have the honor of standing watch over their final resting place. Meanwhile, the investigation into Judge Brennan was accelerating. Legal experts were calling for his immediate suspension. Bar associations were reviewing his conduct. Political pressure was mounting from both parties for swift action, but for Thompson, sitting alone in his apartment with transfer orders to Kansas, it felt like the justice everyone was demanding for him was coming at the cost of everything that had given his life meaning. The video that was supposed to vindicate him had instead made him radioactive to the very institution. He had served faithfully for over a decade. He had no idea that his story was far from over, and that the worst consequences of standing up for what was right were still yet to come. 6 months later, the headlines told two very different stories. Disgraced judge removed from bench ran across the front page of newspapers nationwide. Judge Brennan's career was over. The Judicial Commission had found clear evidence of racial bias, inappropriate conduct, and abuse of power. He had been stripped of his position, lost his pension, and faced possible criminal charges for civil rights violations, but buried on page 7 of those same newspapers, if it was mentioned at all, was a much smaller story. Viral video veteran leaves military after 12 years of service. Thompson packed his belongings into cardboard boxes at Fort Riley, Kansas, where he had spent the most miserable 6 months of his military career. The desk job had been exactly as soul-crushing as he had feared. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, sitting in a windowless office processing personnel files and filling out forms that nobody would ever read. The work was mind-numbing, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that every morning at Arlington National Cemetery, other soldiers were standing guard at the tomb while he was shuffling papers in the middle of nowhere. The worst part was lying awake at night thinking about the unknown soldiers and knowing he would never again have the honor of watching over them. Thompson had tried everything to get back to Arlington. He had written letters to his commanding officers, requested meetings with anyone who would listen, and even reached out to some of the veterans organizations that had supported him during the controversy. The answer was always the same: "We'll consider your request." Followed by months of silence, the truth was that Thompson had become toxic to the military establishment. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because his name was forever linked to controversy. Every time someone Googled Arlington National Cemetery or Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, Thompson's story came up. Military leaders didn't want that kind of attention associated with their most sacred duties. "You have to understand their position," explained Captain Rodriguez, one of the few officers who had been honest with Thompson about his situation. "The tomb is supposed to be about honor and dignity and quiet service. Your story, even though you're the victim in it, brings publicity and politics into a place that's supposed to be above all that." Thompson understood the logic. but it didn't make the reality any easier to accept. He had spent 3 years earning the right to guard that tomb. He had stood in freezing rain and blazing heat, maintaining perfect military bearing while tourists watched and photographers snapped pictures. He had poured his heart and soul into that duty, and now he was being told that his dedication didn't matter because of something that had happened to him in a courthouse. The final straw came during Thompson's annual performance review. His supervisor, a major who had never served in combat and had never stood guard anywhere more significant than a supply depot, gave Thompson an average rating. "Your work here has been adequate," the major said, reading from a prepared statement. "However, your high-profile status makes you unsuitable for positions requiring discretion and low visibility." Thompson stared at the man across the desk. "High-profile status? Sir, I never asked for any of this attention. I was humiliated in a courtroom and someone recorded it. How does that make me unsuitable for military service?" "It's not about what you asked for," the major replied. "It's about the reality of your situation. Every assignment we give you comes with baggage. Every unit you join becomes a potential target for media attention. That's not your fault, but it's not the military's fault either." That night, Thompson called his older brother David, who had left the military 5 years earlier to start his own business. "I don't know what to do," Thompson admitted. "I love the Army. I love serving my country. But they've made it clear that there's no place for me anymore, at least not in any job that matters." David was quiet for a moment. "You know, little brother, sometimes the system doesn't deserve the people who serve it best. Maybe it's time to think about what you want to do with the rest of your life." The decision to leave the military was the hardest Thompson had ever made. Harder than standing guard in hurricanes, harder than facing enemy fire in Afghanistan, harder than watching Judge Brennan humiliate him in front of a courtroom full of strangers. He had joined the Army when he was 18 years old, fresh out of high school with no clear plan for his future. The military had given him structure, purpose, and a sense of belonging. It had taught him discipline, leadership, and the meaning of true service. Now, at 30 years old, he was walking away from the only adult life he had ever known. The retirement ceremony was small and quiet. A few fellow soldiers showed up, along with Thompson's family and some friends from his hometown. Colonel Williams gave a brief speech about Thompson's distinguished service and his contributions to the Honor Guard program. The words were polite and professional, but they felt hollow to Thompson as he folded his uniform for the last time. Thompson thought about all the soldiers who had served before him, all the men and women who had worn these same insignia with pride and honor. He thought about the unknown soldiers at Arlington, still lying beneath their marble tomb while other guards paced their eternal watch. The irony wasn't lost on Thompson. Judge Brennan had suffered the consequences of his prejudice and abuse of power. The justice system had worked, the bad guy had been punished, and civil rights had been upheld. In the court of public opinion, Thompson had won completely, but winning in the court of public opinion didn't pay the bills. It didn't give Thompson back his career or his sense of purpose. It didn't undo the fact that he had been pushed out of the job he loved by the very institution he had served faithfully for 12 years. Thompson found work as a security supervisor at a mall in his hometown. It was honest work, and it paid the bills, but every day felt like a reminder of what he had lost. Instead of protecting the most sacred memorial in America, he was making sure teenagers didn't shoplift from department stores. The veterans groups that had supported him during the controversy moved on to other causes. The reporters who had interviewed him found new stories to tell. The politicians who had condemned Judge Brennan forgot Thompson's name as soon as the next scandal came along, but Thompson never forgot the lesson he had learned. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. Sometimes standing up for yourself means losing everything you care about. Sometimes the system you serve faithfully will sacrifice you to protect its own reputation. A year after leaving the military, Thompson received an unexpected phone call. It was from a high school teacher who had seen his story and wanted Thompson to come speak to her students about service and sacrifice. "I want them to understand," the teacher explained, that real heroism isn't always rewarded. I want them to know that sometimes the most important thing you can do is maintain your dignity when the world seems determined to take it away from you. Thompson agreed to speak to the class. As he stood in front of those teenagers, he realized that maybe his story wasn't over after all. Maybe the lesson wasn't about the unfairness of what had happened to him. Maybe the lesson was about how you respond when life doesn't go according to plan. The thing about serving your country, Thompson told the students, is that you don't do it because you expect to be thanked. You don't do it because you think it will make you rich or famous. You do it because some things are bigger than yourself, and some sacrifices are worth making even when nobody notices. He looked out at their young faces and saw the same idealism he had felt when he first put on a uniform. He hoped they would never have to learn the hard lessons he had learned. But if they did, he hoped they would handle it with the same dignity that had carried him through his darkest moments. Thompson never got to return to Arlington National Cemetery as a guard. But he had learned something that no one could take away from him, that true honor comes not from the uniform you wear or the medals on your chest, but from how you carry yourself when everything else is stripped away.